I'm oral historian Mike Chappell. Today, June 10th, 2009, I'm interviewing Dr. Leslie Degroot for the Endocrine Society at its annual meeting being held this year at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Degroot has been a pioneer in the field of endocrinology for more than 50 years, having made important research contributions to a wide spectrum of topics in the field of thyroidology. These include the understanding of thyroid hormone synthesis and its mechanism of action, iodine metabolism, thyroid cancer, and autoimmune thyroid disease. He is also the driving force behind Thyroid Disease Manager at www.thyroidmanager.org and Endotext at www.endotext.org, two websites that provide physicians, researchers, trainees, and patients around the world with a current, complete, objective, free, and downloadable source of information. Currently, Dr. Degroot is research professor in the Department of Cellular and Molecular Biology at the University of Rhode Island. Please tell me a little bit about your family background, starting with your grandparents.
My grandparents, there being four, one set was born in Holland, and both immigrated to this country in around 1870 or 1880 to upstate New York, and actually to a farm in upstate New York, north of Albany. And I don't happen to know their educational background. One was anyway, and then the other side were Scotch and English immigrants who had come much earlier, but I don't know just how long ago, and lived in upstate New York. And my Dutch grandparents ended up on a farm which became our farm, and my other half of grandparents settled in a little town called Fort Miller, which is not far from where our farm is.
And were your parents farmers then?
Oh yes, my grandfather and grandmother on my father's side, Henry Degroot, was a farmer and had a dairy farm of about 120 acres or so, and they sold milk locally and whatever they could sell. And he had 4 children, including 3 sons, and including my father. And my father stayed on the farm and and actually bought the farm next door and ended up with 2 farms, a couple hundred acres. And he was the farmer, and then I grew up on that farm.
And what type of education did you have?
I went to a local high school. I went to a country school that had 12 students for a while, then a local school in town, and then a high school in Fort Edward, New York, then Union College in Schenectady, and then Columbia Medical School.
When you were growing up, did you have any activities or sports or hobbies that you particularly liked?
I helped on the farm a lot. I mean, it was normal to help on the farm, and I helped on the farm. And I liked to hunt and trap, and I ran trap lines, and I did a lot of hunting and walking through the woods, never much killing, but a lot of shooting. And in high school, of course, we played sports. You know, we skated and we played softball. And in high school, I also played on the high school band and orchestra, but I didn't play any sports in high school. And, there are other things, but those were the main activities.
Were you making any decisions in high school about what you might want to do later in life?
It was assumed without discussion that I was going to go on to college, and without a definite plan, but it was always clear that I should head to college. And I really intended to be a chemical engineer when I guess chemical engineer, but a chemical something when I went to college. That was my goal. I don't know. Oh, I think I do know why. I had a high school teacher, his name was Jack Leonard, who was a very personable guy and did experiments that were interesting, and it got me interested in chemistry. I think that probably is why.
And why did you choose Union College?
Well, I didn't know much about colleges. I mean, I'd never heard of Harvard, let alone others. And it was nearby, and it was considered a very good school, and they gave me a good scholarship. So, several reasons.
And did you continue to work on the farm when you...
Well, in the summer, yeah. School was out sometime in June and started sometime in September. And in between, I certainly worked on the farm all summer. And I rarely, but sometimes, had to come home and actually run the farm for a week or two when my father was ill. But that was fortunately exceptional.
And what was campus life like at Union College in the mid to late 40s?
Well, you know, this was, I graduated I started in 44, ended in 48. So this was right at the before and at the end of the Second World War. And so the return of veterans was a dominant factor there were two distinct groups, the younger people and then a bunch of guys who were veterans that had a lot different life experience than we had had. But other than that, I think it was pretty normal. I joined a fraternity. I had several jobs while I was there. I had to work part-time, and active in a variety of college extracurricular activities. And we lived in a fraternity house, and had a terrific time. Spent a lot of time drinking and chasing women and having a good time, and also working.
What was your major?
Well, at first it was chemistry, but then Union had a nice program called a Division III major, which meant you were in science, but it didn't specify an exact particular slot in science. And it allowed you to take courses in liberal arts without having a major in liberal arts. So my central area was science, and then I took other courses in economics and similar courses.
Did you have any special contact with the faculty there?
I mentioned economics because it was fortunate to be able to take upper-class courses without having to go through necessarily a set of prerequisites to get that level. And I had a teacher, his name was John Lewis, who taught economics. And he was a very gifted guy, actually became a member of the President's Economic Advisory Council under Eisenhower, I think. And then I had a couple very good teachers in genetics and in embryology, although I blush to admit I can't remember their names. But anyway, they were courses that I found very interesting, and they were very good teachers. But the one person whose name sticks in my memory is John Lewis, John E. Lewis.
And what decisions were you making in regards to a career in medicine?
Well, at that point, I mean, I don't think in college most students have any vague idea what medicine is actually about, except it deals with sick people, but at the practical level. And I certainly had no vague idea what medicine was about. But I did know it had to do with caring for ill people, and that it was a science in part. And I was intending, after my first after my second year, I was clearly intending to go to medical school.
And how did you choose medical school?
Well, same sort of not very logical approach. The medical schools that I really considered were Albany Medical College and Columbia. As I said, I really didn't even know about schools in Boston or other areas, and I really didn't apply to them. And I applied to Columbia, and they offered me a scholarship, full scholarship. So that was quite an enticement. So I went to Columbia.
How were you supported as a student?
Well, my pop gave me some money, and I had a job all the time I was there. I served meat on the cafeteria line. I was a technician doing blood counts and chemistries, and did a lot of that, but I had a job all the time. And with my pop's support and full tuition, I was able to get by.
Did you still work on the farm sometimes?
Well, you know, after the first year, I couldn't. I mean, at the end of the first year, we had 3 months off, and I was home then. But then after that, really, I was gone from the farm, except on vacations for a few days.
Did any of your jobs that you had, your part-time jobs, did they spark an interest in endocrinology?
No, I don't think so. They just gave me some food to eat.
Who was your mentor at Columbia?
Well, mentor is a little complicated. I mean, the guy that was the most dramatic force at PNS was Robert Lerb, who was professor of medicine. He was a very austere guy who I think was a terrible judge of human nature, actually, but who demanded very high-level performance. I mean, he really didn't accept anything except high-level best. And he was a very tough customer, and he was very hard on medical students, frequently would just tear them apart for very little reason. And people were in awe of him. And I think in terms of thinking, not thinking, but in ingraining my own attitude about work and how to do things, I think he was a mentor. But as a personal confidant and a person helping with a career, he wasn't. And actually, I don't think that I had one that at PNS. I had my roommates, you know, we talked, and other people, but I don't think that I really had a mentor other than Lerb, and he was only sort of a mentor.
What type of physician were you thinking of?
Well, I think I was, well, I liked internal medicine, so I had, I sort of had an interest in internal medicine. I had, because of Robert Lerb's interest, I was interested in nutrition, not in the sense of a diet, but in the sense of metabolism in the body. He was very interested in that area, and that sort of rubbed off on me. And I was also interested a little bit in the thyroid and endocrinology because of a guy whose name was Sidney Werner, who was an interesting, bright, and kind of scrappy guy that I kind of enjoyed his personality.
And he was in the thyroid?
He was in the thyroid field, yes.
And when you started to look at the thyroid at that time, how did you feel about it?
Well, you know, what happened, Mike, you know, I cannot say that my career was well thought out, as you can easily tell. At the end of my 2 years of residency, I was uncertain what I was going to do. And I actually wanted to go to work with a guy, his name was Ted Van Italy at St. Luke's, working on nutrition. But he didn't really have a spot. or money to support me. And I was sort of looking around as to what to do, and I was drafted. I got a notice, you know, you've been assigned to the draft, and then you're going to go in the Navy. And several people at the PNS had gone to the NIH and had positions. And if you did that, it qualified as military service, because the public health service. So I drove down, or I don't know, took train to Washington, D.C., and went to the NIH and met the guy who was heading the endocrinology branch of the National Cancer Institute. I had learned that they had an opening, and I went there and was able to apply for and receive a position at the National Cancer Institute, and then was able to get my way out of the Navy into the public health service.
Now, let's see.
And the person I was assigned to work with was Monty Greer, who was a thyroid researcher. So that's why I was telling that story.
Okay, so you had, it was your interest came by way of the people that you knew who were interested in the thyroid, not necessarily you were interested in that particular
Yeah,
way.
Absolutely. It was...
but then you grew to really...
It was because well, it was several. I mean, but Monty Greer was my mentor at the National Cancer Institute, and we became very good friends, and he was a very, very fine guy, and certainly sparked my interest in research in that field. We published a paper together, and we competed for a prize together, and there were several other young people in that same group, so there was a nice camaraderie and a nice intellectual stimulation. And then he became the conduit to go on to work with John Stanbury at MGH. He was kind of helped me get into that, and so that's when I really got into the thyroid.
Let me ask you, you met your wife your future wife, when you were still at Columbia?
Yeah.
And what was her background in her career?
We met at opposite sides of a bed, caring for a young woman with, we both remember very well, a young woman who had rheumatic heart disease and was in an oxygen tent. And we were rotating tourniquets on the limbs, which is what one did in those days in people with heart failure, one of the things. And she was a very attractive young woman, and I became interested and fortunately was able to eventually convince her to marry me. And she lived in New York. Her father actually ran a mining company, quite a different background from mine. She was a student nurse at Columbia.
Okay. Did you have any children?
We have 5, yeah.
Are any of them in medicine or science?
Yeah, I have. My daughter is in medicine, in AIDS and immunology research and vaccine research, and is now at University of Rhode Island. She has her own biotech company that does this work and has NIH grant. My son is a orthopedic surgeon at a hospital in Newton Wellesley Hospital in Boston. And then I have his wife, but not is a obstetrician, and another daughter's husband is an internist, so we have quite a few doctors.
Okay, let's see, your internship and your residency, how did you come to do them at Presbyterian Hospital?
Well, I guess in part because I was lucky to get there. At the time I was going into residency, the 3 best places in the country were Mass General, PNS, and Hopkins. Hopkins was far away, and I actually was accepted at MGH and at Presbyterian, And I'm not exactly sure why I chose, I don't remember exactly. I mean, I'd lived there, I knew it, maybe that helped. But it was considered one of the very best programs, and I felt lucky to be there.
Were there any feature or features that stand out during, any feature or features of your internship or residency that stand out that you might want to relate?
Well, you know, it's a fantastic time in a young doctor's life. I mean, there are various things that happen. One is, as a medical student, you're sort of treated like a king. I mean, nothing bad happens to you, really. When you become an intern, you get on the bottom of the totem pole again. Totally, you suddenly switch roles, and you're, especially in those days, you're the scut boy. But the other thing, the thing that's more important, really important, that's just trivial, is the fantastic immersion into medicine. I mean, all of a sudden, one day you're a student, and the next day you're in charge of taking care of people. And it's a fantastic immersion, and now it's not quite so heavy duty, but we didn't have a lot of time off. We might have a day or two off every other weekend, but we worked certainly 12-hour days, 5 or 6 days a week, and had night call. And I mean, it was heavy duty, big immersion, and a wonderful experience. I mean, you just are learning and growing so much in your career. I think that's, I don't know what other people felt, but I know the people I was associated with had that same sense. I mean, you really haven't got time to think about world issues and your future career too much. You're sort of totally involved in doing your job.
Now, when you finished up with your residency before the draft, how did you imagine your career was going to go at that point?
I thought I was thinking of an academic career at that point, although I didn't have a clear idea of what that would be or what it would amount to, nor the area. So as I said, I had toyed with nutrition and possibly gastroenterology, and then ended up assigned to work with an endocrinologist, and so that's how carefully I thought it out. I'm sorry about that, but that's what happened.
Why sorry? I mean,
Well, I mean, I'd be nice if I could tell you that I had a carefully planned program from the beginning, but it wasn't the case.
Let's see. Okay, so when you got to the National Cancer Institute, NIH, you said you were working with Monty Greer.
Yes.
Let's see. What was he working on when you started?
He had a couple interests. He was interested in neuroendocrinology, and actually he was quite advanced in what he was doing, mapping the hypothalamic nuclei by implanting electrodes in rats and then stimulating them and looking at responses, and for control of appetite and drinking behavior, things like that. And he also was doing clinical work on the thyroid, evaluating the effect of certain drugs on thyroid physiology. And he got me going to measure, wanted me to measure thyroid stimulating hormone in a biological assay in baby chicks using radioisotopes, and I set that up. And I worked with him in a study on, and I've forgotten it, but it had to do with sex hormones and thyroid function, but I've forgotten the exact nature. And then we were involved in a clinical study. We had patients in the Clinical Research Center at the NIH, and we were doing studies on the effect of drugs that were used in treating patients on the metabolism of thyroid hormone using radioactive iodide as a tracer element.
Had you decided on thyroidology at this point?
I'm not sure that I had, but I certainly, I had spent a year in it and had learned a lot about it. So now I knew that field better than any other. So maybe without making a clear decision, I was edging that way because of my training during that year.
And were you set on your career going into endocrinology?
I think probably at that point, yes. But as you know, I got interrupted by a trip overseas for a year, and then what happened was that Monty Greer left, and I didn't really want to start off on a new program with somebody else for a year, and we'd always considered some sort of going overseas and working as a medical missionary had been an idea, and sort of my family was quite religious, and I had that in the background of my head. And so we were recently married, and we heard about an opportunity to go with the State Department to Nepal. And so we went looking for that, and eventually ended up in Afghanistan for a year. And then when I was in Afghanistan, I had to arrange to come back to finish my training. And I had by this time decided that Harvard was the place to go. And so I wrote and asked to come back to finish my residency at Harvard. And the chairman there arranged that I come back and spend 6 months working with John Stanbury in the thyroid lab and then start my residency. So that kind of got me back into the thyroid research, and I think that's probably what cemented my program at that point.
But you weren't seeking to work with John Stanbury, and you weren't seeking to work necessarily on the thyroid. It happened.
It's an awful thought. But actually, when I did know who John was, and did know that he was doing very high-class work, and that he had an outstanding laboratory. But when I don't remember whether that was involved in my decision-making. It may have been. But Monty Greer wrote a letter for me, and so that may played into it as well.
So it was John Stanbury, you were in his lab?
Yeah.
What was he like as a scientist?
Well, John was definitely a mentor. John was and is a very fine guy. I spoke to him yesterday. He's now 95, maybe, and in good shape. He had at that time really the best lab in the world in that field. And it was sort of oriented toward biochemical aspects of research on thyroid disease. And he had a group of young people that came from all over who were just terrific people. I mean, they all have gone on to very fine careers around the world. Italy, Belgium, France, England. I mean, they were very good people. And so it was a wonderful place to be. And John is a very nice Southern gentleman and kind of a Brahmin type, and also interested in doing research and doing medicine correctly and high standards. And he taught me a lot about that, and he gave me a lot of freedom. And he also taught me a little bit about writing. He used to go over my writing and correct it with a heavy red pencil, and taught me a lot.
What was the state of the art in thyroidology at that time?
This started pre-anything. I mean, we did not know anything about DNA. We did not know anything about protein structure. We knew that genes must exist, but no gene had ever been identified. I mean, it's hard to imagine how, in retrospect, how primitive our knowledge was at that time. This is 1956, 54, 55 I started there. And, I mean, things were just boiling up at that point. So we, basically it was physiologic research on the effect of drugs or iodide deficiency or something on the thyroid. And it was biochemical research using the tools that had been developed to study intermediary metabolism in cells in general. I mean, a lot was known, the Krebs cycle and this, that. A lot of biochemistry was already known, but nothing about genetics and molecular biology as it's known nowadays. So we worked on the metabolism of the thyroid cell, and we worked on hereditary defects in thyroid hormone synthesis that cause thyroid hormone deficiency. And we worked on metabolism of radioactive iodide as a tracer for thyroid hormone.
And let's see, what laboratory research did you actually do? And let's say what laboratory research did you do?
Well, I did a lot of studies on iodide kinetics in humans. Fed them radioactive iodide and measured distribution in thyroid and blood and urine and feces and tissues to some extent. Analyzing the way the iodide was transported and incorporated into hormone and metabolized and excreted, and did that a lot. In the laboratory, I started working on thyroid hormone biosynthesis, and we purified an enzyme called thyroid peroxidase that was involved in thyroid hormone, and we studied the energy supply, the source of the energy that created the hydrogen peroxide that was used in the biosynthesis of thyroid hormone. And we studied patients that had metabolic defects that made abnormal iodinated proteins, for example.
How did this advance the field?
How did this advance the field? Well, the method of purification of the hormone, of the peroxidase, became one that's generally used. I mean, it's not a Nobel Prize kind of thing, but it was the method that was used subsequently. The information on the generation of hydrogen peroxide was fairly unique. We found one source of congenital metabolic defect causing goiter. Subsequently, there were 5 or 6 that were identified, or many more now, but that was one of the ones that was being identified. I mean, none of them were world-shaking events. They were not Nobel laureate stuff, but they were good, solid research studies and earned me some recognition in the first 5 or 10 years of my career.
And who were your colleagues at this time?
Well, the people in this lab I mentioned were outstanding people. A guy whose name is Aldo Pinchera, who eventually developed a wonderful program in Pisa, Italy. A young man whose name is Jacques Dumont, who became a very prolific and important thyroid researcher in Brussels. A guy whose name was Reginald Hall, who became a outstanding and widely respected thyroid researcher in England. And I mean, there were a whole group of people from Austria, from Denmark, from Australia, all of whom were really wonderful researchers and people, and they were my intimate colleagues.
What tools were you using?
Well, we used radioisotopes for many studies, especially the studies I was doing in humans. So we used scintillation counters to enumerate amounts of radioisotope. And we did chromatography, which is a way of separating radioactive iodide-labeled compounds in the thyroid, was a very important technique. But then we used all kinds of other standard biochemical techniques, and I spent a lot of time working with an oxygen electrode, measuring formation of adenosine triphosphate during phosphorylation and energy consumption in mitochondria. And we separated proteins and analyzed them on electrophoresis. We used standard biochemical techniques that were available at that time, and we used a lot of isotopes and a lot of chromatography.
Would you say that the lab work was technologically driven?
No, I mean, I think it's always one has a question or a program, and you try to use the best technology you can find at the time. So is technology limited maybe because you decide there's a question you're interested in, and then you figure out how you're going to approach that, and you use the best technology, but sometimes you can't do anything with the question at that moment. But I think it's technology heavy and technology limited when you can't do something, but I don't think it's driven by the technology.
What factors what factors determine what areas you were looking at? How did you, from all these varied areas that you were interested in?
Well, the iodide kinetic work I really got into because John Stanbury wanted me to do it. He thought he had sort of pioneered studies in that field in endemic goiter. And so he sort of wanted me to continue it and employ it in studies on normal human physiology, which is what we did. So and then the others were, some of the studies were determined by the fact that a patient came along that had a history of a thyroid abnormality that hadn't been explained and had a big goiter. And we would study that patient and try to figure out why, what was wrong with the thyroid physiology. So that was a second way that our research got directed, and it might be one kind of problem now, and then another 6 months we'd have a patient with another problem, and we would study that. So we pursued individual patients or families. And then the other area was more trying to apply, at that particular moment, apply the knowledge of what was known in general about intermediary metabolism to understand how the thyroid processes worked in relation to making thyroid hormone and control of making thyroid hormone. I mean, we adapted understanding from, say, a learned in liver or some other tissue, and used those tools and techniques studying thyroid physiology.
You ended up staying at MGH for about 9 years?
Oh, 12 years, actually.
12 years?
Yeah. Well, 10 years there and 2 at MIT, but I was still at MGH.
And let's see, you would have been happy to just to stay there?
Well, that's a complicated issue. I had been there 12 years, or actually I was there full-time 10 years, and then I was at MIT 2 years, but my clinical practice and teaching was at MGH. I had never quite made it to be assistant professor, although I'd had promotions every year for 10 years. But there are a lot of levels in between where I was in the next step. And so my fate probably was to find a job elsewhere, although at MGH at that time, you had to provide your own support. And you did that by a grant or usually practice. And I supported myself from research grants and practice, and as did most of the people there. But probably my future would have been, had I stayed there, eventually to go to another medical center someplace.
And you became a member of the faculty at Harvard in that period too. What kind of teaching were you doing at Harvard?
Well, the teaching was clinical teaching. We taught second-year students history taking and physical examination, for example. And we taught third and fourth-year students on making rounds on patients and doing consults and in the clinic. It was all clinical teaching. It wasn't giving lectures.
And how did you organize your day?
The normal thing was to go to the lab and work like hell. I mean, do a lot of work. And we worked 5 days, and we often worked until 6 or later. And we usually almost always worked Saturday morning and part of Saturday afternoon. And then we'd typically spend 1/2 a day seeing patients. The rest of the time was in the lab. And the teaching responsibilities were modest. I mean, they would be maybe the equivalent of 1/2 day a week at the most.
Oh, it was a half day a week?
At the most. Oh. I mean, if you're making consult rounds or doing seeing patients as attending on the service, you'd be very busy for a month. But that would only be once a year or something. So I say, on the average, maybe the teaching responsibility was not more than 1/2 day a week.
Now, overlapping your 4 years, your last 4 years at MGH, you were at Harvard, 1961 to 65. You also were at the New England Journal of Medicine. How did that come about?
The editor, Joe Garland, had 3 associate editors, and one of them was a friend of mine, and he was leaving to go out to someplace in California, and he suggested my name, and I was interviewed and got the job. Or the job got me, one or the other.
And let's see, what were your responsibilities?
The responsibility was to read and review 1/3 of all the journal articles submitted, which was at that time about 10 to 20 a week for each of the 3 associate editors. And we reviewed them and wrote a little critique and gave it orally at the board meeting. The editorial board met every week with several very distinguished and austere Boston physicians. There's an editorial board of probably 10 or 12, and they were religiously there. It was considered a very important thing. And they also read some of the papers. Usually one of them had read a paper, so they had an opinion. And then we gave a report. And sometimes they were farmed out to somebody outside, but that was not common. And then they were given some kind of score, and the editor decided to accept it or not.
How far had your career advanced at this point?
Well, I was a budding young researcher and investigator, still struggling upwards.
And how did you come to move to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology?
Well, John Stanbury moved and moved to MIT, and he asked me to go with him, basically, and offered a position as associate professor, which sounded quite exciting. And I think I was still paid out of my own research grant, but my pay probably went up $1,000 or $2,000, which was a lot in those days. We went there to run a clinical research center, and basically I occupied my time doing research and running a clinical research center at MIT.
What clinical research did you do?
Well, I did more studies on iodide kinetics with isotopes, and I've forgotten what else. Well, we did continue our basic research on thyroid, on the metabolism of the thyroid and the formation of thyroid hormone. But I met a young guy who came to see us who had some strange cases that seemed like they might be due to resistance to the action of thyroid hormone when I heard about him. And that was an idea that was not a unique idea at MGH, because there had been previously, under Fuller Albright, the recognition of resistance to parathyroid hormone. So there was in MGH sort of the mystique of hormone resistance. So when I heard about these cases, that's what they sounded like, and so we started collaborating with this young guy. His name is Sam Refetoff, and we did a lot of work on that. And these people lived in Watts, actually, in Los Angeles, and we brought them out, and they lived on the Clinical Research Center for a year. A boy and a girl, and eventually the mother and another child, and they also lived with us. They became part of our family at times. They were deaf mutes. That was one of the important points about them.
Who supported that research?
NIH.
Was NIH. Okay. And at that time, the work you were doing in that area, the resistance, did that have any therapeutic?
Well, of course, we hope so, but I mean that became a very big field, and it involved the nuclear receptors and the study of the nuclear receptors. I mean, at that time, we did not know that there were such things as thyroid hormone receptors. What we established was that these people had a metabolic rate and other signs that they were normal metabolically, even though their thyroid hormone level was twice normal. So they were clearly resistant to the action of thyroid hormone. And it was that our studies evaluated the amount of hormone that was required by their body and the biochemical changes it produced, but mainly it found that they just didn't respond normally because they took twice as much thyroid hormone to turn on their metabolism as it did a normal person's.
Why did you leave MIT in '68 for the University of Chicago?
Some people offered a interesting position in Chicago. I mean, two good friends came out twice, visited me twice, and offered a position in the endocrine section at Chicago, and offered to make it. One was Ed Ehrlich. He was the junior one. The other was his boss, and I'll think of his name in a second. And I know it as well as I know my own, but it's not there. But anyway, they offered a situation that seemed very attractive because it was sort of my own group and opportunity to set up a program that would be more or less my own making, and a promotion and a salary that seemed significant in those days, but is so far away from significant today, it's hard to believe.
Did John Stanbury play a part in getting you that
Well, in a
position?
certain sense he did. He thought it was a terrible idea. He thought that if I went to Chicago, I would soon never be remembered on the earth again. That was the end.
But you went anyway.
Yeah, my family was I thought it was a good opportunity, and we already had roots in the East, and we would not give up our association with a farm or New England, and we'd come back, and our kids and my wife were very excited about moving to this integrated neighborhood of Hyde Park, and it seemed like a much more exciting life than living in Winchester, Massachusetts. It was an exciting time, you know. That was during the time we drove from Chicago, or from Boston to our farm in upstate New York, the riots broke out in Chicago in the election of '68. And we watched on TV as the riots went through Chicago. It was an absolutely wild time. We were moving to that spot, and we landed there, and shortly after I started work, within a couple weeks, the students took over the administration building, and some of the faculty was asked to stay in the building even though the students had taken it over. So it was a very wild time. I don't know if you remember that, but the fall of '68 was a very, very wild time in the country.
Do you remember what you thought might happen?
Oh, I think people were, of course, it had to do with the Vietnam War and protests against the Vietnam War, but I think people were worried that the country might fall apart. I mean, it was chaotic. It's hard to imagine it, but lawlessness was significant. I mean, you know, there were wild groups plotting, blowing up universities and government buildings and shooting people, and I mean, it was pretty chaotic, pretty wild. So I think we thought eventually we'd get through it, but there were certainly concerned that the power of the government was being destroyed.
Would you sketch out the thyroid study unit? Was there a thyroid study unit, or?
The thyroid study unit became my group, myself, and the researchers working with me, and then Sam Refetoff, who joined us after a year. And then we had a group of other people that worked with us. We had people in radiology and surgery and pathology and ophthalmology who would join us for clinical studies and evaluation of patients and teaching programs. So the thyroid group was small. It was 2 or 3 senior people, and then maybe quite a few, up to 10 or 11 or 12 younger people, fellows, and then another group around it that were other professionals that would join us for teaching programs.
How was your day organized at that time?
Well, initially when I was there, I'd see patients one full day and be involved in a teaching program half a day, and the rest of the time I would work in the lab with my fellows, either doing something or supervising something.
What were some of the features of your thyroid group that you particularly liked?
Well, I mean, it's like running a boys' club. It was, I had at its peak maybe 8 or 9 fellows of my own that were working on probably 3 or different projects, or 4. They each had a project, but maybe there were 3 or 4 main lines of research. And so it was running a boys' club, helping people develop and finding support and taking care of rivalries and keeping them interested and involved, and it was, and benefiting from the intellectual discussion and excitement. I mean, the best thing about it was that these were bright young guys who wanted to go far as they could in medicine and who were working hard as they could, and so it was intellectually very exciting.
Now, you said you had a couple of lines of research going on at the same time. What factors led to the lines that you were working on? What choices were involved there? Or what was the motivating factor that led you in a line of research?
Well, I became interested in autoimmune thyroid disease when I was at Mass General. And the reason was because it was very common. And I mean, 6% of women get, or maybe a little bit less than that, maybe 4 or 5% of women get an overactive thyroid during their lifetime. And 20% have thyroiditis, which is a very common condition, and of those, maybe 6 or 10% become hypothyroid. So they're very common diseases, and so I was interested in understanding the etiology, thinking of therapy of an important common thyroid disease. So that was, I think, one. And also immunology was developing, and that was another reason. And then we had started working on thyroid hormone resistance, and so that became a central focus in our laboratory. And then when we got to Chicago, it turned out that there were a lot of people that had thyroid cancer, and students and staff that we were caring for. And it was all related to the use of X-ray therapy for treating tonsil and adenoid enlargement at another hospital, Michael Reese. So we got interested in radiation-associated thyroid cancer, and we did a lot of research on that and on the epidemic of these cancers and detecting them, and whether one should detect them and how to detect them, and that sort of got us into the field of thyroid cancer. So there's 3 lines that we were in easily, at least 3.
So one of the lines is because it was a big disease, and then another one was because it was locally right there.
I was dealing with these patients, yes.
And those are So those people that were at the University of Chicago, those were people who had been exposed to radiation at Michael Reese?
Yes.
You tracked it down?
Yes.
And, yeah.
Yes. Or other places, because radiation happened to be especially used at Michael Reese, but it was also used widely. At that time, I mean, it's hard to believe it, but because actually the connection between radiation and thyroid malignancy had been established certainly more than 10, maybe 15 years earlier. But the idea that you should find people that had been irradiated and check them for cancer had never been promoted, nor was the public aware of this connection, and actually radiation was still used up to about 1959 and maybe even later for benign conditions. So it was a problem that was continuing at that time.
And what about today? What in regards to thyroid cancer?
Well, what happened was that the topic of radiation-associated thyroid cancer became very sort of a hot topic for a few years. And around the country, hospitals set up programs to check patients that had been irradiated, and people became aware of it. And there was a period when these patients were discovered and treated, but let us say they were treated in the 1950s, and now we're talking about the 60s and 70s. And as time went on, the treatment had been used less, especially after 59, and the patients, the onset of tumors was about 10 years commonly or so, after 10 to 12 years. So that passed, and so the incidence went down, and nowadays, while it still happens, it's much less of a significant problem than it was. Of radiation-associated thyroid cancers, much less of a problem.
Regarding mechanism of action and thyroid hormone synthesis, were you doing that before you moved to Chicago?
Yes, we were, and we continued that. That was a fourth line that we worked on. We were interested in antibodies. We were purifying the thyroid peroxidase. And we were also studying antibodies to what was called microsomal antigen in the thyroid.
Is this in Massachusetts? Or?
Well, it started there and it continued. And then, lo and behold, it turned out that they were the same thing. The antibodies were against thyroid peroxidase. So that was quite a new and exciting finding, which we discovered, and also a group in France at the same time, actually. So we were working on purifying thyroid peroxidase, and with an idea, finally, as time went on, of trying to clone it if possible. We never got there. And we were working on autoimmunity, and we investigated families with autoimmunity quite a bit. That was a big interest, the genetics. And then we got into looking at what are called T-cell epitopes. The T cells in immune reactions respond to pieces of a protein, little short pieces. And so we investigated and have for years the epitopes that are made out of the protein that are recognized by T cells. And we studied that. And we studied various ideas on the causation of thyroid autoimmunity, lack of suppressor cells, for example. So we were pursuing several different things, and we were also at the same time working on following thyroid cancer patients clinically. We made a registry, and we eventually collected hundreds of thyroid cases that we had evaluated, and we analyzed their natural history and their treatment and treatment methods. And we also were at this time heavily into looking at thyroid hormone receptors. And we actually cloned 2 forms of human thyroid hormone receptor, and we identified with Sam Refetoff, the absence of a receptor in the first family that we had investigated years earlier. And we did a lot of studies on thyroid hormone receptors for the next 2 decades.
What were the most important tools that you were using at Chicago?
Well, that became much more involved in molecular biology, cloning, sequencing genes, looking at the factors that control the function of a gene. It's called the promoter, looking at proteins that bound to the promoter of a gene and activated the gene. So the tools were much more in the nature of molecular biology as time went on.
How did you go about learning molecular biology?
Well, I actually took a year off in 1973 and went to France and worked in a laboratory, just did research on, but that was not so much molecular biology, it was thyroid biochemistry. But then later on, I took another short sabbatical and went back to Mass General and worked with a guy who ran the parathyroid research laboratory and learned more about molecular biology so that we could apply it in our laboratory.
And were you taking care of patients all through?
Yeah, always. I always had a good-sized clinical practice.
And did that include outcomes research and analysis? Was that part of that?
Well, for thyroid, as I said, we developed a registry of several hundred thyroid patients, and we analyzed their treatment and course and the state of the disease when they were diagnosed, and then the method of treatment, and so we could look at. We had patients who were treated by one kind of surgery or another, or who were given radioactive iodide treatment or not, and we could analyze those differences. So that definitely was outcomes research.
And was your study unit, was that innovative in that regard?
Well, I think actually our first studies on the thyroid cancer patients were a little novel in the sense that we introduced in that field, I think we were probably the first paper to publish data using survival curves. We had a computer program, it's a nice program called Stata, that allowed us to manipulate the data and analyze it and compare treatments and groups of patients. Not an earth-shaking an application of something well-known in other fields, but I think probably that was actually one of the early applications in thyroid. And I got deeply into thyroid cancer and its treatment for a time, and we set up a National Thyroid Cancer Cooperative Study Group with about 50 members from all over the country, and we designed protocols for treatment and tried to get money to support it from the government, which we never got. And I finally gave that up after a few years, but the group persisted and still exists to this day. Now, must be 20 years later, but it's actually run now by a guy's name is Steve Sherman at MD Anderson, but it is still called the National Thyroid Cooperative Treatment Study Group, and it does outcomes research using protocols for treating thyroid cancer.
Why did you leave the University of Chicago for Brown University?
Well, it was time. I must have been at age 70 or something or more. I wanted to slow down a little bit, and I took a program that allowed me to work half-time for 5 years with the agreement that at the end of that time, that was the end. I had to leave. I actually could have stayed on if I hadn't made no arrangement. I could have stayed forever because the rules of the university and the government were such that if you already had a tenured position, you could stay there until you could no longer function. Anyway, I wanted more free time, and so I made this arrangement for 5 years of half-time service, and then at the end of that 5 years, it was time to go. So I went, and I had a grant, so it was possible to set up an arrangement at Brown, move my grant to Brown.
And why did you pick Brown?
Well, it was in Providence, which is not too far from where our home is. That was one reason, a very good reason. And because Bob Smith, who is the head of the endocrine section there, was willing to help me. And also because my daughter was there and at Brown, and I actually moved into her laboratory, took over part of her lab, one section.
And what research were you, well actually, let's see, what area is your daughter working in?
Well, my daughter Annie is, she's a very bright, hard-working woman, and she's interested in a lot of things, but her research is interested in immunity, developing vaccines for AIDS or for anything else, TB, Lyme disease, whatever. And so her research in particular involves identifying good pieces of a protein or DNA molecule for use in making a vaccine. So her research is related to vaccines and to immune responses to T-cell epitopes in making vaccines. And so the techniques that she uses and the responses are almost identical to what we do in autoimmunity. We're interested in stopping it. She's interested in producing it, immunity, but the techniques and the ideas are very close. So it was, I mean, we shared ideas and interests.
Is that your epitopes, is that your main line of research right now, or your exclusive line of research?
Well, at this particular moment, my research is slowing down and may come to an end before long. But actually, at this moment, we are working on T-cell epitopes to the TSH receptor and the way that they might be used in treating autoimmune disease.
And why did you leave Brown for the University of Rhode Island?
Well, I think the easiest answer to that would be that my daughter moved to URI to set up a big lab, and I moved with her over there. It was a move of a mile, and easily done, and it's more complicated than that, but that's a good enough reason.
Okay. Would you speak a little bit, would you speak a little bit about your web publishing? What is Thyroid Manager and what is Endotext?
I'd love to. John Stanbury got me into books. He edited a book called Metabolic Basis of Inherited Disease, which was a very outstanding book. Began with his interest in these metabolic defects in the thyroid. And then while I was there at MGH, he got me to work on a book called The Thyroid and Its Diseases, which had been originally published in 1932, and I made the third edition about 1964 or something, and kept that going for many years and until the sixth edition, I guess. And then through John's suggestion, I got interested in endocrinology text, so we developed a textbook called Endocrinology, which is it's the best endocrinology textbook in the world, very simply put. It's called the Bible of Endocrinology, and it's outstanding, if I do say so. And so I was involved in that book, and then in the thyroid book. And the thyroid book didn't sell many copies, and it was a lot of work. And we got the idea of maybe putting it on the web. And Abbott gave us some money to help do it. And so we converted it to a web-based textbook it's not a printed book. After, I think the sixth edition may have been in 1995, and then in about 2000, or maybe 1999, but right around that time, we put what we had at that time on the web. And after that, a group of people, 24 people, responsible for individual chapters, have kept updating it. So it's constantly updated. And that goes on. So the book disappeared, but the book is on the web. It's a virtual book. Anybody can print out the whole thing. And then we got the idea, well, if we can do this for the thyroid, maybe let's do it for endocrinology. So we set up the Endotext, which is a complete endocrinology textbook on the web for free for anybody in the world. And to me, it has a great educational appeal. I mean, we literally get every day people from China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Mali, Nigeria, South America, Europe, Russia, using the site. And I think that's wonderful, personally, that we can provide a really high-class source on clinical endocrinology without charging people anything.
How rapidly can you update?
About 5 minutes.
And how many authors are involved with this?
About 400.
Okay. Would you say something about your service to the Endocrine Society?
Well, you know, I have not been heavily involved. I was on the council for a short period of time, a long while ago. I've been on various committees, most recently on the Guidelines Committee, and worked on the background for that committee, and then was on that committee, and then after that, actually chaired the committee that wrote a guideline that came out a couple years ago, guideline on thyroid disease and pregnancy. So I've been quite involved in that. I'm involved currently in another program which has to do with bringing young people from abroad to the United States to work with a mentor for a year or two. It's the International Scholars Program, and I'm one of several people that helps them find their job.
Find a job, is that what you
Find a position with a mentor in this country. Yeah, a laboratory.
What will you be doing at the meeting this year? What will you be doing at the meeting this year?
At the meeting this year?
Yeah.
Well, I spent a lot of time at we have a booth. The Endocrine Society kindly allows us a booth without cost, which is very nice of them. And we have a booth, and we advertise our websites by handing out information, advertising cards, various things, and talking to people, and promoting the website, because even though a lot of people know about it, an awful lot don't, have never heard of it. So we're constantly trying to promote that. And I also have a poster that is on display, and I have to go to some meetings, like the International Scholars presentation and meeting, but those are the things I'll be doing.
And what are your current views of the field?
Well, you know, it's been a fantastic ride. I mean, to consider where we were in our knowledge of human physiology and biochemistry and disease in 1950 or 48, when I started medical school. I mean, when penicillin was brand new and streptomycin hadn't even arrived, and we treated heart failure with kidney poisons, and research was fantastic if it did it with a chromatogram, to where we are today. I mean, the increment in knowledge is so fantastic. It's been a wonderful experience, and I think anybody that's lived and worked through this particular era must feel that way. I mean, it's just been it's an amazing thing to be, even if a low-level part, to be part of that historical advance in human biology. It's been pretty exciting, I think.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.